Since 1977, the Saba Lions Club has been a pillar of service and community care on the island. What began with 20 committed members has grown into a legacy of giving back, supporting those in need, and advancing the global mission of Lions Club International. From cultural events to signature service projects like Meals on Wheels and the Food Bank, the Saba Lions Club supports the elderly, disabled, and struggling families with compassion and consistency. Their health programs, like annual eye care support and glucose fairs, continue to promote wellness across the island. The club is also a champion for the environment, proudly maintaining an adopted hiking trail and backing local cleanup efforts to protect Saba's natural beauty. Several of its members have been honored with the prestigious Melvin Jones Fellow Award for their outstanding dedication, proof that the spirit of service is alive and well on Saba. The Saba Lions Club, serving with heart for the good of all.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you. Welcome to Amanhana. Thank you to our hosts for allowing us to have our presentation this evening. And a hello to our live streaming audience. If you're not on Saba, you'll be happy to know that we had a little weather, but nothing like anybody thought it might be, not even as much rain. So let's all be excited about that. Let's start with a round of applause for the Lions Club. It's the Lions Club that allows us to have our live streaming, contributing to it, so thank you very much. For those of you who weren't here today, we had the last couple days, not only did we have our great presentation by Dr. Lodge, she led a field project this morning that was pretty awesome with discovering new fungi never seen before on Saba. But also showing how important it is for our forests. And then this afternoon, McKeel led his field project, uncovering different insects and vertebrates on the Crispine Trail. So that's the history. Let's talk about the future. But before we can do that, we have to make sure we recognize our major sponsors. There are many, but our primary financial sponsors are the Culture Fund of the Caribbean, the Nature Environmental Policy Plan, together with public entity Saba. As you can imagine, it costs a nice chunk of money to run a month-long program, and they help make it possible. We have over 50 sponsors since we started in 2003. They all contribute in different ways, so look for logos, things you recognize, and please make a thank you anytime you can recognize a sponsor. Whoops, sorry. Our speaker tonight is generously sponsored by the Cottage Club Hotel, and he will be telling you that that's where his field project will be tomorrow, but we'll let our speaker tell us more about that. And we have some new faces in the crowd tonight, so we're going to do the super hustle about our raffle tickets. So if you saw the intro slides, there are fantastic prizes from night stay at the wonderful Flamboyant Cottage. Shout out for Larry and Sherry who sponsor that. Thank you. We have Tim Schmitz of Marshland Investments. He gives away a week at his lovely place in St. Croix. And we have a week on the Caribbean Explorer liveaboard. We have Makana tickets. We have wonderful jewelry and crafts that you saw on the intro slides. All kinds of things that make it well worth your while. More than $10,000 worth of prizes for $5 a ticket. But most importantly, this year's raffle proceeds are supporting Critter Quest in 2026. And why is that? Critter Quest is super important. It's helping us establish a baseline data for biodiversity on the island. And more than 12 scientists will be coming in during that time. And we could use a little more financial support to help make that happen. So all the proceeds of the raffle are going to Critter Quest.
And we're donating $1,000 to support that effort.
Wow. Wow. Take that, Emily, so I don't lose it. Wow, that's amazing. For those of you who don't know, that was Joe's wife, Jean, our presenter, giving back to our program. So that's pretty incredible. Thank you. Okay, so anybody who wants tickets, see Emily now or me later, but here we go. Sorry. So, coming up tomorrow morning at 7 a.m. is a bird watching activity with Dr. Joe, who's going to tell you more about that during his talk. We got a blue background here, so you're not seeing it, but tomorrow at the Cove Bay, and we can provide transport for anyone who needs it. It is the premiere of David Attenborough's last movie that he's making called Ocean. And the reviews we're hearing are that it's amazing. The movie is free of charge, but there will be dinner served. If you are coming for dinner, you need to let us know if you have not registered already. The taxi pickup will be at 5 o'clock at the tent, and it'll be a very nice evening. Wear blue, please. There'll be a bit of social cocktail hour before the movie starts, and there will be an intermission, and it promises to be a nice evening, great way to socialize, and great way to appreciate an incredible man and a great movie. Monday at Island Flavor is where our next presentation will be. Tim Cernak is getting in tomorrow. He got delayed because of the weather. Joni just sent her menu, and it looks fantastic. So let us know if you need transport there and if you will stay for dinner at a very reasonable price. And I see a few hats sported here. Anyone who does a field project actually gets a free hat. They are sustainably created from recycled plastic, but you can't buy them. You got to earn them. So here we go. Tonight's speaker, with over 40 years of experience, where's Andres? Soaring through Caribbean bird research, Joe Wunderle is truly the bird's eye view expert on disturbance ecology. From hurricanes to habitat changes, Joe's work helps protect our feathered friends and their ecosystems across the islands. Whether teaching, leading field projects, or co-authoring field guides, Joe's passion for tropical birds and conservation shines bright. His dedication has made him a cornerstone of Caribbean ornithology, and his yearly Christmas bird count tradition is a true labor of love. Let's give a hearty round of applause for the bird guru himself, Dr. Joe Wunderle.
Thank you. Well, thank you for that kind introduction, and I'm very pleased to be invited again to see and learn. It's been a number of years since I've been here, and my wife and I are both happy to be back and to participate. Now, if you read the website, it played me up as a hurricane chaser. Now, in reality, that's not the whole story. The real story is that I am chased by hurricanes. particularly after I've done a study on an island where I have studied the vegetation and the birds, and I have obtained what we call baseline. Shortly thereafter, storms seem to come through. So my project tomorrow may be viewed as laying down baseline. I rather hope not, but it does reflect my reality, and that's how I got into this business of studying hurricanes. The first one hit us in Puerto Rico, 1989. You've all seen before and after studies or pictures, and of course a nice closed canopy looking very much like Mount Scenery. The next day it looked like this. It looked like a temperate zone forest in December, a broadleaf forest, all right? But the shocking thing is, it happens so quickly. I mean, if you're from the temperate zone, you're used to going from something like this, and then, you know, a few weeks later, it eventually looks like this. Do this in just a few hours. It is absolutely shocking. And you can never figure out how the various plants and animals can come through this, but they do. They show remarkable resilience. However, to understand the response to hurricanes, it helps us to break them down into direct effects and indirect effects. Now, most of you know the direct effects, and these are what you would expect. Mortality from exposure to winds, rain, and flooding. Here's a cattle egret that I found very close to my home in Puerto Rico after Maria. These flamingos on the beach were found in Cuba after a hurricane, and the poor tropic bird here was found on the beach after hurricanes Irma and Maria. So there definitely is mortality. How much mortality we don't usually know. The other thing is that there's a geographic displacement by the winds, and if you're a bird watcher, you love to go out after these storms to see what the storm brought in. Frigate birds are transported all over, out into the continent of the US and even into Canada. Naughty terns, the same story. Now here's a picture, I'm going to go over it a couple of times, of a rather interesting case of a bird transported by winds. This was a streaked shearwater. Many of you may know shearwaters. They're pelagic birds. They're found well out at sea. They're related to the albatrosses. They're masters at flying. And they usually don't fly very high, and they rarely come to land. Hurricanes may force the issue. Well, a researcher in Japan named Shioma had 14 of these shearwaters radio tagged with satellite transmitters, and he was able to follow one of them that got actually caught in the storm, and that's what we're looking at here. We're looking at one of his shearwaters circling within a typhoon. A typhoon, of course, is a cyclonic storm, just as a hurricane is. They're the same beast, all right? And notice we rerun this several times, and the bird basically moves in here, does about 5 or 6 loops within it, presumably within the eye, we don't know, but it increased its speed. It got up to about 80 kilometers per hour, which for this bird is quite fast. It also went very high. This is a bird, and you look at the name shearwater, they literally shear the water under normal circumstances. This bird got up to over 4,000 meters in height in this storm when it went over Japan. So how did it get out of the storm? I mean, yeah, you get into one of these things, but how do you escape this? Well, what it did was, and you'll see here, came to the end of land because it could look down, And it plopped down and it sat right in the ocean there and waited for the storm to pass over it. And then when it went on its way to go feed where it normally does up there north. So that's how it got out of it. So some of these seabirds, particularly these pelagic birds that have very strong flying abilities, can escape these things. I'll point out the juveniles, however, do not do so well. So the mortality that they find in these shearwaters on the mainland Japan are generally the juvenile birds. Indirect effects. These are the effects that are not so obvious. These are the effects we tend not to think much about. But these tend to be the most important effects in the long term. And that's the important thing. These indirect effects can cause populations to finally crash or to take many, many years to recover. This includes the loss of food supplies and foraging substrates. Here we see the loss of palm fruits. This is what it looks like before the storm. This is what it looks like afterwards. Change in the habitat structure and composition. This is particularly important for birds of the forest. This is a cross-section here of a rainforest. You see the canopy trees here. This is a gap here, and then the canopy here. Well, of course, you can see a blowdown here, perhaps as a result of a hurricane, and it takes quite a while for trees to go up and fill that gap. Well, if you're a gap species, you're in Fat City. But if you're a canopy species, you're in trouble. Change in cover. Major problem. There are things out there that eat birds. Red-tailed hawks, which we have here. Pearly-eyed thrashers, of which we have a fair number on this island. They also at least will eat nestlings, major predators. So birds have lost their cover, their protection from predators, parasites, and competitors. And finally, the roost sites come down, or the nest sites with the trees. So these all have major effects. Now let's look at the response of a diversity of organisms after one hurricane. Now this is a complex diagram put together by my colleague in Puerto Rico, Jess Zimmerman, or I should say colleagues. Jean has worked on this project also, and this is a diagram showing the response of organisms and ecosystem components to Hurricane Hugo in 1989. They followed these organisms or ecosystem components for 5 years. So you see the time after the hurricane here. But to put them onto the same axis, because they're diverse measures, what they did was they developed idealized response trajectories. Now I say idealized, that does not mean imaginary. They're based on data. They've just cleaned up the scatter to make things a little more visible. And they compared the populations to their baseline, that is their pre-hurricane levels. So this is the pre-hurricane level right here. This is the baseline. And there are some components that actually increased, so they went up, or they decreased and they went down. So this is how we interpret this graph. Now, surprisingly enough, there were sudden increases in some components, but not terribly surprising. Look at all those dead leaves and limbs on the ground. That's biomass, dead biomass. It came down all at once. All right, so a very abrupt increase and then fell down to baseline levels. In B, we see a curve where it took a while to increase, but that's what the shrimp did. The shrimp took off because they had more light on the streams. More light was more algae, and these guys were grazers, so they were in Fat City. So they increased. The Eleutherodactylus frog, the coqui frog in Puerto Rico, breeds on land, and it needs hiding places to reproduce and to escape predators. Well, look at all this litter and all this stuff here on the ground. That's the sort of stuff that these coquilles like. So their populations just took off and then eventually returned to the baseline level. However, there were populations that showed catastrophic declines, and suddenly, right after the storm. But they showed different levels or trajectories of responses. If we look at C here, this is what some of the snails did. Some of the snail populations came crashing down, but then they very quickly not only reached the baseline quickly, they surpassed the baseline. So there were more snails than before. Some of the bat species, such as this Jamaican fruit bat, they declined, but they shot up also. And as the name suggests, they feed on fruit, and although there was no fruit immediately after the storm, with all of that light, there was abundant production of fruit, many of the shrubs, the small berries used by this particular fruit bat. Excuse me. Now let's look at D, a little different response. This is the red bat. It's an endangered species. It's also another frugivore. And for various reasons, its recovery was much slower. It does not disperse as well as the fruit bat. And we think that's what did it. So it returned to the baseline level. E, the tailless whip scorpion. It's an amblypygid. Their populations recovered rather slowly, which was a blessing for the coquilles because this is a major predator on the coquille young and eggs. So knocking back your predator, that's actually a pretty good thing if you are coquille. Finally, the walking stick, the phasmid, did not show an increase at the end of 5 years. Now, eventually, I don't know whether it took 10 years to do it, but at least in this particular publication, it had not recovered to its baseline level. Okay? So here you see a diversity of responses. Think of this as the various organisms that are important, either food items or competitors or predators of birds. I've shown no birds because they didn't include them in their study, but I'll show them now. This is how we got into our first hurricane study. And I use the word we because my wife, Jean Lodge, was an important member of our research team, and we received a grant from the World Wildlife Fund to document the distribution of birds, particularly migrant birds, on the island of Jamaica. We did this in 5 different locations on Jamaica, shown here with letters, from sea level up to over 13,000 meters. And of course, we counted all the birds, both the Jamaican species, the endemic, and the resident species, as well as the migrants. And at each of these sites, we sampled several different habitats. And the way in which we sampled the habitats was with a very standard bird method of using what we call point counts. And as the name suggests, the observer stands at one location for 10 minutes and counts all of the birds seen or heard within a 25-meter radius around them. After they finish that, they move off quickly 100 meters to the next point until at the end of the morning they've completed 15 of these. There were 2 of us working in different parts of the habitat, not overlapping, so we would have a total of 30 of these point counts. And that's how we made those studies. My wife ran the mist nets, so we had samples of birds which we could band, and the mist nets allowed us to capture birds that we didn't necessarily see on the point counts. And the other important thing was we measured the vegetation before the storm hit. Well, this was done in December of 1987. We were done with Jamaica. We enjoyed it. We thought, well, that's fine. We get a break. Well, Hurricane Gilbert arrived in September of 1988. It was a Class 3 hurricane on the Saffir-Simpson index, winds of about 178 to 208 kilometers per hour. And it was terribly destructive to the island. It went down the backbone of the island. It was over the island for more than 2 days. All right, so it was incredibly destructive. At least 45 people were killed, $2 billion in damages. It was a disaster for the poor island. So the residents suffered greatly. We were able to go back to World Wildlife Fund and obtain grants to return to see what had happened to those study sites and those birds that we had sampled beforehand, which is what we did. So we went back in January of 1989 and replicated those baseline methods. I'm going to show you some results from that study. And fortunately, we were able to get into all the locations. It took a lot of work, a lot of climbing over down timber or crawling under them, as the case may be. So it was something of a challenge. Well, what sort of patterns did we see in the bird populations? Well, here's a diagram or histogram showing the changes in bird populations at high elevation, montane habitats, greater than 1,300 meters, and lowland habitats below 900 meters. And for each of these habitats, we looked at before versus after, and we tallied for each species the direction of population change. Did it decrease? So we tallied it here. These are the decreasing populations. Or did it show no change or an increase? The black bar shows the increase or no change. So here we see in the montane areas more decreases than increases or no change. In contrast, in the lowlands, we see similar numbers, 100 decreasing populations in the lowlands and about 110 increasing or no change. These were significant differences. The population suffered more in the montane areas than the lowlands. Why? Well, these pictures here give you a hint of what was going on. Now remember, this was done 4 months after the passage of Gilbert. High elevation, no evidence of regrowth, no buds coming out. It was just, these are just the remains of leaves. They're not leaves that have grown on. In the lowlands, particularly at sea level, this is what we saw. This is a downed tree from the hurricane. Here's a vine growing over it. Here you can see the remains of trees covered with leaves. In 4 months, they had greened up. So a major difference in elevation in terms of the response of the vegetation. And for the plant physiologists, this is not surprising. Plants grow more slowly at high elevation for a lot of reasons. They also recover more slowly at high elevations than lowland. Well, let's look at these montane habitats and the types of species that actually change their populations. Same type of analysis, but in this case what we've done is we've divided the data or the bird species into diet groups, or what we call feeding gills. And we were able to do this because there's good literature available on the biology of the birds of Jamaica. And so we were able to classify birds as either nectivores, birds that feed on flower nectar, birds that feed on fruit or seeds, frugivore seed eaters, or insectivores. And we broke that down into 2 groups of insectivores. The resident, that is the Jamaican insectivores and the migrant insectivores, that is, the migrants from North America. Okay? And as you can see, although the numbers are small, the patterns are pretty clear that more declining populations of nectivores than increase or no change. That's just two. Look, the frugivore seed eaters, massive declines, whereas the insectivores, no change in the residents and hardly any change in the migrants. This pattern is an important take-home message. What it emphasizes is that the greatest effect of these storms is in the aftermath rather than during the storm itself. That's why we have these patterns. Now let's look at these insectivores. These guys, these are the Jamaicans. They were there. These are the North Americans. These are the tourists. They weren't there. Most of those migrants don't arrive until October. This was a September storm. Most of the migrants, terrestrial migrants, warblers, vireos in particular, arrive in October. So most of these guys weren't even there. And look how similar those results are. So keep in mind, it's often the aftermath that is the bottleneck, the squeeze for these populations. Some pictures of what these birds actually look like. If you've been in Jamaica, you've probably seen them. Here's a orange quit. The term quit comes from Africa. And the enslaved people in Jamaica gave the name orange quit, banana quit. There's several other quits. So it's an African term. And so we've got orange quits, endemic bird related to the tanagers, declined in high elevation. The grass quit, another quit. This one being the yellow shoulder grass quit, being an endemic, declined in montane areas. Black-faced grass quit, widespread species throughout the Caribbean, actually, and they, for some reason, declined in the dry limestone scrub. Here was a migrant that declined. Now, this is a bird that feeds almost exclusively on insects. This would seem to be the exception to our rule that insectivores seem to come through these things. What's going on? Well, what happened was they declined in shade coffee plantations. Now, as many of you may know, coffee is often grown under a shade canopy. Well, the hurricane took off the canopy. That's where the black and white warblers were. They lost their foraging substrate. They left the area. So if you lose your foraging substrate, you move. So they declined. And the national bird of Jamaica, the streamer-tailed hummingbird, declined in 3 different habitats at high elevation. So they showed massive declines. No surprise on the declines. Back to the fruit story. Question, yes?
Is the grass quit the same as the Caribbean bullfinch?
No, the grass quit's different than the bullfinch. Yeah, smaller bird.
Okay. It's smaller.
The quit is smaller, yes, yes. This is what fruit looks like in the fall, September, October. Little later, November, it ripens and then it's fed upon by Puerto Rican parrot, highly endangered species, and pearly-eyed thrashers. In fact, reproduction in both those species is coordinated with fruiting of this Sierra palm. Well, this is what the palms look like after Hurricane Maria, and this is what the fruit looks like. Pretty sad story. So what did they do? Well, they delayed breeding. No surprise. There wasn't any food, so they didn't have the resources to reproduce, and they didn't, or they delayed. Although the following year, they did quite well. And I would point out that palms show remarkable resilience. These may look like matchsticks and look pretty sad with very few palm fronds, very low mortality. Next year you come back, they've all almost all of them have got fronds. So if you're going to plant a resilient plant in a hurricane zone and you want to help some birds out, think about palms. They hold up quite well. Of course, the nectivores suffered in the same way the frugivores did. They lost their resources. They would even go down to the ground to feed on flowers. Here's a case of a poor Antillean crested hummingbird female on the ground feeding not on a flower, but on a colored piece of paper. This is after Maria in St. Martin. So pretty slim pickings for the nectivores. So what's the story with these insectivores? Why do they seem to hold up? Well, a couple of explanations. One is the nature of their prey. Insects have short life cycles. Some of the stages of the life cycles can be hidden in protected areas. So it doesn't take long if you lose the leaves and you lose those that are on the leaves, but if they have a stage under the bark or in the ground, they can come in and take it over. So the short, fast life cycle is an important issue. In addition, there's a lot more food around for them. The detritivores are animals, organisms that feed on dead stuff. Guess what? There's a lot of dead stuff. So it's Fat City for the detritivores, dead leaves, small branches, branchlets. So their populations take off. And when the sun gets in the understory, there's leaf out. Those young leaves are hit by a variety of different foliivores feeding on the foliage, herbivorous insects. Here's some coleoptera, some beetles defoliating new leaves. These cecropia have been attacked by I don't know whom. And here's another tree. That's all insect damage. That's not hurricane damage. And one of the things with our first hurricane, we noticed it. And we thought, well, this is quite unusual. And then the next and the next and the next, we saw the same sort of pattern. And what happens is a lot of these organisms escape their predators and their parasites or parasitoids, and they just explode. Because we don't usually have a lot of defoliation in our forest here. And if you go up onto Mount Scenery, I'm sure that if you go up under normal circumstances and look in the understory of the undisturbed forest, you'll be hard-pressed to find any evidence of herbivory by insects. But after hurricane, the story changes. Well, back to Saba. Who do we worry about on this little island? Not a big island. And what we've learned from our Jamaica studies and so on, there should be some, we would expect some very vulnerable species. And indeed, there are. Bridled quail doves, ground foraging dove in the rainforest. Their populations are highly sensitive to hurricanes, and it was nicely documented recently in Statia after Hurricanes Irma and Maria. Their populations crashed. We saw that earlier on St. Croix. The population crashed there, and we saw it in a related species in Puerto Rico. The interesting thing is the species survives, but once the forest opens up, they disappear. Now where they go, we don't know. They don't like forest openings. And of course, after a hurricane, they have got forest openings. So they have got a real problem. So this is a sensitive species. Now, its range, it's endemic to the Caribbean, and it's mostly up here in the northeastern part of the Lesser Antilles, and sort of the northeastern corner, and they must move between islands. So they must recolonize, and that's what we hope is the case. But I mentioned nectivores, and of course, purple-throated carib populations decrease. We know that. Green-throated caribs decrease, and Antillean crested hummingbirds decrease, as does the nectivorous bananaquit. But you'll be happy to know we should see all three of those species tomorrow. They seem to be doing fine. So they seem to have pulled through. And bananaquits are not hurting at all. But part of the story is a very high reproductive rate. What about this very colorful bird? In fact, I think one of the most colorful birds in the Caribbean, or terrestrial birds, the Antillean euphonia. And we speculate, and I credit Mikel, who's looked at this, that it was last seen in the 1950s. There have been no records since. And it's probably been lost, and I would credit a hurricane with it. We know that their populations go down fast after hurricanes. They feed on fruits, in fact, parasitic fruits, Laurantheaceae, mistletoes, and they disappeared from the island of Vieques, one of the small satellite islands of Puerto Rico, and they even tried a reintroduction program that didn't work, but that was, it seems, possibly related to hurricanes. So this could be a hurricane extirpation. Be great if we see it. Well, one of the things that makes determining population size afterwards is these birds move. They do have wings. We don't have any flightless birds in the Caribbean. And we do know that the montane dwellers will shift or move into the lowlands. And we have good evidence with bananaquits from our Jamaica work where they declined in montane, high elevation pine plantations, coffee plantations at high elevation, but they increased in wet limestone forest and also dry limestone forest. And we have observations from other places that they will move. They go where the food is. You know, I don't just sit there and bitch and moan about the fact there isn't any food around. They move. The other thing is that they're canopy dwellers just shift to the ground level. Just as this was the canopy after Gilbert. If you look very carefully, you'll see my wife, Jean Lodge, in there measuring the vegetation. She couldn't come out to pose for the picture, but she's in there. She was getting good data, and somebody had to take that picture. So anyway, thank goodness. The fact of the matter is that canopy species like this Puerto Rican toady, which are primarily canopy species, came down to the ground level. Toadies, by the way, are species, well, now endemic to the Greater Antilles, although they're fossils from North America and from the Eocene, in all places, France. Now explain that. Anyway, these are widespread in Puerto Rico, and if you've got a good canopy, they're up there. And we did a misnetting study where we used very fine nets strung between poles, and at ground level, between, maybe half meter above the ground up to maybe 2.5, 3 meters height at most. And we captured all the birds. It was a one-year study in the rainforest in Puerto Rico. And we classified the foraging zone of the birds we captured. And what we found was, before the hurricane had relatively low captures of canopy dwellers. 2 weeks after the hurricane, the mist nets were filled with canopy dwellers. We had tons of these guys. Why? Because there was nothing up there. It was all down at the level of the mist nets. What happened to the understory dwellers? Absolutely no change at all, despite the fact that it looked like the forest had been nuked. All right, so the quail doves, which I showed you an example of, a different species but the same group, they were there in good numbers. Now, they eventually disappeared, But the point here is they will shift, they will move into areas. So this makes it very difficult for us to determine the actual number. This is a species, however, where they have good data on numbers. This is the Puerto Rican parrot, which at one time was one of the most endangered birds in the world. Fortunately, the populations are doing better, but they were knocked back drastically after Hurricanes Irma and Maria in Puerto Rico. That was in the fall of 2017. Those two hurricanes are about 2 weeks apart. Many of you may have gone through them because they came through the Eastern Caribbean. You may have experienced them, just as the parrots did. The decline, this is the path of the storm. Irma was mostly offshore, so relatively little little damage to the eastern part of Puerto Rico. But Maria was the real killer, and that was the one that went in here as a Class 5 hurricane. It slowed down to a Class 4 and then proceeded across the island. Luquillo Mountains, there was a population of Puerto Rican parrots, and in Rio Bajo, north central Puerto Rico, there was a wild population of parrots. What happened to those populations? 96% decline of the birds in the Luquillo Mountain, of the parrots, versus a 45% decline here in Rio Bajo. Quite a difference, and yet the level of destruction, if you go into those forests, or if you did at that time, it was virtually the same. You couldn't see any difference. What really was the difference? And I would point out that even in Luquillo, we saw flocks of parrots after Maria, as many as 11 birds. They just disappeared. But what they did at Rio Bajo, they put out feeders, parrot feeders. And what had happened is these feeders were placed outside of the aviaries. When they established the population in Rio Bajo, they started them with artificial feeding in these trays with natural or native foods. And so after the hurricane, parrots in Rio Bajo knew where the food was. What about the poor birds here in Luquillo? There were no feeders. They had never used feeders before. Some of the birds eventually returned to the aviary. They did put some feeders out, but they finally lost them. In fact, the population in the Luquillo Mountains was effectively exterminated. There were none left. Well, we've learned from that, big time. You can guess with all releases now, they train them to feed at feeders, and they know where it is. What do we think happened? Well, no food. You saw what the fruit looked like. Also keep in mind that the forest has a very high density of red-tailed hawks. Red-tailed hawks readily feed on parrots. If you've ever watched an Amazon parrot fly, they have these little wings and they sort of just flap like this. Now, we're not talking about some speeding swallow or swift. We're talking about something barely afloat above the canopy. Well, put the animal above the canopy with no food, no cover, and a lot of red-tailed hawks. And the red-tailed hawk population, by the way, did not go down much at all. They had parrots to feed on. So they got hit with a double whammy, both low food supply, no cover, and high population density. Yes?
Wouldn't the one on the east, is that Luquillo?
Yes.
Wouldn't that have been hit harder by the hurricanes than the other Bajo?
That's a good point. But they also got not only the eye, but they also got a lot of the eastern part. Now, it is true that this section here was really clobbered, and as with most hurricanes, as you correctly point out, the real damaging winds are in that northeast quadrant because it combines the counterclockwise wind with the forward movement. So there is something to that. And there undoubtedly was some direct mortality from the hurricane. In fact, it was quite high here. A colleague had 25 parrots with radio transmitters on them, Puerto Rican parrots in Luquillo. He had been studying them before they arrived. All of them he found dead immediately after the storm. They were killed in their roosts at night. But nonetheless, the population was still, as well as you can see here, was somewhere in the mid-50s beforehand. So they didn't all necessarily die with a direct mortality. So, of course, what can we do? Well, fairly obvious. The message there with the Rio Bajo Puerto Rican parrot feeding and feed your nectivores. Help those bananaquits out, help those hummingbirds out. And in fact, that's just what Birds Caribbean did after Irma and Maria. You may remember them. They clobbered this part of the Eastern Caribbean. Irma first, and then Maria. And Birds Caribbean raised funds to ship over 4,000 hummingbird feeders to about over 15 islands. Bottles of nectar, well, that's sugar water, a little colored in, I guess. 1,850, and 5 tons of bird seed. And we ship that, and these are some of our partners, and despite the fact that many of the folks on the island were still without electricity, many still had difficulty getting water for their own homes, nonetheless, people took a real interest in helping their birds out. So when we provided feeders and seed, they jumped at it, and the school kids in particular, and we involved students. Here's a principal over at Statia with his students, hummingbird feeders. Here's some Dominica with a locally made feeder for the seeds, and here's some Dominica again, and Barbuda. So people really did go out and get those feeders out as quickly as they could. And the birds certainly used them. Now, do we have before and after studies? No, we don't. We have observations of the birds using them. Did this help? We think so. But it certainly helped the spirits of some of the people on those islands because they were happy to see their birds getting some food. So we did get some good local involvement. The other thing, of course, is that these storms do take out the nesting cavities, and for a long time, the Puerto Rican Parrot Project, immediately after various hurricanes, and we've had a lot of them in the Luquillo Mountains, they put up artificial nest cavities, and the parrots would, in fact, use those. So they were very quick, particularly the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Forest Service would put those up. They'll do the same thing in the States with the red cockaded woodpecker. This is a species that uses old-growth pine in the southeastern U.S., and they have put in artificial cavities because these parrots take several years to make a cavity. And after a hurricane, for example, outside Charleston, one of the Forest Service service areas had a population that got clobbered by the hurricane, but they managed to get these in there and help the birds during that bottleneck period. And finally, and I think this is the most important part, birds caught in small habitat patches, islands of small habitat patches, are at risk. I mean, people ask, well, can hurricanes cause extinction? Well, I think the example of the Puerto Rican parrot in the Luquillo Mountains is an example, if not of species extinction, at least extirpation. And indeed it can. And the Luquillo Mountains, relatively speaking, now sitting on Ceiba, of course, it's a little different story, but the Luquillo Mountains are a small, isolated mountain range surrounded primarily by suburban areas and build-up areas, a lot of habitat loss. So you really want to protect your habitats, and particularly keep in mind you need lowland habitats because they can serve as refugia after the storms when your uplands are still recovering. All right, so what am I doing tomorrow? Well, we're going to look at hummingbird bananaquit chaos. And if you've ever watched a hummingbird feeder with bananaquits and hummingbirds, it looks like a lot of confusion. And we're going to try and make sense of it. So we have two focal feeders set up. We're going to divide the group into two. One group's going to watch one feeder, and another group's going to watch the other feeder. And then after half an hour or so, we'll shift to the different feeders. One feeder has got a fairly good cohort of hummingbirds, green-throated carobs, purple-throated carobs, and I just saw a Antillean-crested hummingbird there today. And of course, we have no shortage of these guys, bananaquits. So we're going to look at what's going on, and we're going to look at, in the case of the hummingbirds, potential territoriality and defense. And we're going to look at the behavior of the bananaquits, and we're going to record the behavior of the bananaquits, because they can respond in interesting ways. Now, I've been watching these feeders for the last several days, so I have some preliminary data, but that doesn't mean that I know what we're going to find. So we're going to go and take a look. Now, why is this of any importance besides the fact that it's fun to watch these guys fight while you're feeding them? Well, that's fun. But it turns out the distribution of hummingbirds in the Eastern Caribbean is rather interesting in terms of the numbers of species. High islands have 3 species, a big one, a middle-sized one, and a tiny one. Low islands, without mountains, have just 2 species, a little one and a medium one. And it doesn't matter the area of the small island. It's the elevation. So what's going on? Perhaps this will give us some insights. This will give us something to think about. But it should be interesting. So tomorrow, if you have binoculars, bring them. If you don't, that's all right. We're going to sit fairly close. You can see these birds come to the feeder. We'll call out the behavior. So if you're interested, 7 o'clock, meet at the tent. And then folks will walk over to where we're doing the demonstration. And finally, we're fortunate in having Mikael Boken, who is the expert, by the way, on the tropic bird here. He's done nice studies on the reproductive success. He's been banding nestlings for, I don't know, did you say 20 years? 15? 15 years, so he's been following this population, the red-billed tropic bird, and I'm sure a number of you have seen them as you've gone diving or have been out to sea. Anyway, this island is blessed with a fair number of them, and we will do that 3 o'clock Sunday afternoon, and then meet at the tent. We'll go down and we'll watch those birds. Whether there are any nesting birds, available so we have a domestic scene like this, I'm not so sure, but we'll certainly see a good number of the adults flying in and out to nest sites. So, I think, finally, a meeting. Trinidad, Port of Spain, be there. July 2026, Birds Caribbean is having their 25th international meeting, and these are great meetings. We raise funds to bring people from all different islands. Trinidad will be a challenge because it's going to be an expensive meeting, but we do have workshops, all sorts of training opportunities, plenary presentations, oral presentations, posters, field trips. There's some great birding sites there. Very diverse presentation and tremendous networking opportunities because it's not unusual for people on one island not to know what's going on in terms of conservation on another island. And this is a tremendous opportunity to do that. So I would encourage you to put that on your calendar. We have a website. Just look up Birds Caribbean. It's one word, and you'll go right to our website, and you'll see information there. With that, I thank you. Yes, questions?
All three hummingbirds on my feeder, and the banana fish. And I've noticed one banana fish, and I think it's the same one, actually always hunkers down. He can be dived on and let back seated, and he is not going to move.
I don't know if you heard that, but apparently she's described a defensive response by a rather clever bananaquid faced with the onslaught of three,
One of the three, or perhaps sometimes two.
yes, she has all three species of the hummingbirds and suffers greatly from their attempts to dislodge them from the feeder. We'll see some of that tomorrow. It was great today, and I don't want to give away the whole story, but Antillean crested a tiny hummingbird, if you've ever seen it, and one of them persistently harassed this bananaquid that was at the feeder feeding away, and it just sort of looked over its shoulder with this sort of withering look of sort of like, do I need this stuff? And they some of them will show that, but they show some other curious and behaviors. The other thing that's interesting, these species do divide up in elevation. We're in the overlap zone, as you pointed out where you live, have all three species. But if you go down closer to the coast, you will probably not find the purple-throated carob, whereas if you go higher up in the Mount Scenery, you probably will not find the Antillean crested hummingbird. They sort of sort out in elevation. So anyway, so, hey, yes, go ahead. Oh.
What is your recommendation for the ratio for making nectar for the bird feeders?
I'm sorry.
The recommendation for the mix between sugar and water for the bird feeders.
We just looked that up. 4 parts water, 1 part sugar.
Weight or volume?
What's that?
Weight or volume?
Volume. Well, yes, sugar, yes,
We do it with volume.
I read recently that some people think it's not a good thing to give food to the bird feeders to the birds. What is your take on it? Obviously, you think it's a good thing for the parrots that you're having in Puerto Rico, but for the hummingbirds, you think it's a good thing to feed them, even without being during a hurricane or after a hurricane?
Yeah. You can feed them. They'll come in. But it is true, it takes a while for them to learn where the feeder is. But after a hurricane, they're moving around, and they can spot a feeder pretty quickly. So, but the other thing you have to be careful with these feeders is it does not take many days for your sugar water to grow all sorts of bacteria, and so you want to clean your feeders regularly. We clean the feeders today for the feeders we're going to use tomorrow, so they're going to have fresh sugar water. And so that may actually have some effect too, because there are a lot of other feeders on the grounds of the hotel that have the old 3-day, 4-day-old sugar water. But anyway, yes. Questions?
I know a lot of tropic birds nest on Saba, but sometimes I see lots of them and sometimes few. Is there a nesting season for tropic birds?
Yes. Come on the field trip. We have the expert.
Oh, I gotta wait for you.
He wrote the major paper on it, an important paper on it. Yes, it is.
Here I'll say that the first eggs are laid in August and the last eggs in May. But it lasts for 4.5 months from laying of the egg till fledging of the chick. So year-round can be found some occupied nests. But the peak of egg laying is in winter, so in December, January.
Thank you.
Yes.
You mentioned. Yes, you mentioned that one of the reasons that populations went down after a hurricane was change in color in the birds. Change in color in the birds.
Not necessarily changing the color of the birds, no.
Okay, what is the color of the vegetation?
Oh, cover, I'm sorry, I misheard. Yes, cover, leaves and vegetation. Yeah, it's leafless. And that's, and often these birds, a lot of these birds will do, and you saw that picture there when I talked about the canopy coming to the ground level, you get this tangle of all sorts of branches and branchlets and so on. Birds will forage in that, and you'll get fair numbers of them actually in those tangles. Because one, there's some insects in there, and two, they're also lizards. And those lizards are eaten by a lot of birds, particularly large insectivorous birds. They love to feed on those anolis lizards. They're just great little packages of protein. And, pearl-eyed thrashers snarf them down. Gray kingbirds will feed on them. A number of species that you don't think of will feed on them. The great egret, which you may have seen, if not on this island, other islands. It stands about this tall. It's a white egret, and it occurs here. We had one yesterday, or the day before, at the hotel grounds, and it was foraging and undoubtedly going after anolis lizards. They spend as much time terrestrially foraging for lizards as they do along the edges of rivers, streams, and the ocean. So, yes.
So this is more of I'm just going to talk real loud. So this is more of an observation. You said that there weren't any pre-post studies of nectarivores on Saba before and after Irma and Maria, but for my other Saba people, I don't think that the populations have recovered, and for people who watch them, I'd like to know what you think, because from my perspective, if you go back to like 2017 and earlier, we saw banana quits and the hummingbirds all the time, and now I see them rarely, and so for my other Saba people, I just was curious if you have the same observation.
I found it took at least a good 8 years for the hummingbirds to recover. And they're nowhere near as good as what it used to be.
It can take a long time, particularly for hummingbirds to recover. Hummingbirds have a clutch size of 2 eggs. Now they may have multiple clutches, but they're often spaced out. Bananaquits will have a clutch size of 3 and have several clutches in a row, even successfully or even after a depredation event. Bananaquits have a very high reproductive rate, hence the numbers of bananaquits. So even though you'll see both hummingbirds and bananaquit populations really tank, the bananaquits just come right up. And in the introduction, when Lynn talked about my background, I've been running this Christmas bird count in Puerto Rico for 30 years, 31 years now. We've gone through several hurricanes. Christmas bird count is where you go out with a group of enthusiastic people and you count all the birds you can find in a circle with a diameter of 15 square miles. And you do it within a 2-week period around the Christmas period. And it was developed primarily for the temperate zone, but we make it work down here. And I can turn out, or we've been able to turn out as many as 40, 50 volunteers of all sorts to help us in these counts. And we've gone through, we went through Irma and Maria, and one of the species that suffered, of course, was the euphonia, which I mentioned. But that Antillean crested hummingbird, that tiny little guy, they suffered. Their recovery was very slow. Now, they were restricted only to the eastern part of the island, but they were in the circle. And we've looked at their recovery, and it's been quite slow. So it takes a number of years. But they've also got to compete, not only with other hummingbirds, they've got to compete with insects. So they've got other pollinators, and they've got nectar robbers to worry about, including bananaquits. Bananaquits are notorious nectar robbers. They're little thieves. I mean, I'm sorry, but and I know that, Ceba's a safe place, but you've got this forest filled with these nectar thieves, and this nectar thieving that I'm referring to is bananaquits. If they come to a flower that has a floral tube of that length, they don't go in not with that little tiny bill. They, of course, don't go in that way. They go to the back and they make a hole, and then between the calyx and the corolla, if you're a botanist, and they make a hole at the base and they suck out the nectar and move on to the next flower. Well, of course, that's not very helpful to the legitimate pollinator that goes in through the front, although the tiny Antillean crested hummingbirds have learned to use these holes opened up by the bananaquits at the back. So they've stopped pollinating also, depending on the type of flower we're talking about. But then you add in carpenter bees that go to the back, and they'll defend the area. And then some other bees, and then, of course, some butterflies. Then the story it's ecology. It just keeps going and going, So, anyway, but good observation, interesting observation. Well, thank you. Have a nice dinner.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Joe. That was fabulous. If anybody has more questions, I would think that Joe is happy to answer them privately. And we will hope to see you tomorrow morning at the tent at 7 a.m. at bird time, and tomorrow evening at the ocean premiere. If you need transport for that, you need to let us know so we order enough taxis, okay? Thank you. Have a great evening. Thank you, Amanhana.